I am trying. And we are live today with a very special guest. We are talking this morning with the one, the only, the enigma, the legend, Arne Duncan, the man who has not only served government and served kids across the country in education, but also has some hops, can hoop. Big ball player. Good morning, Arne Duncan. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Never had any hops. I apologize for that. a little bit of game, no hops.
No hops. Okay. Well, for those watching, you all, I'm sure, know Arne. Arne was the United States Secretary of Education under President Obama. Was there from 2009 to 2015, which was a great time to gain a lot of perspective about the main issues in education reform, issues like teacher preparation, teacher evaluation. He worked through the Race to the Top, worked a lot on school turnarounds nationally, and also state standards that would be able to help us stop states from gaming the system when it came to knowing how our kids were doing and how we needed to improve in education. At the top, I would just like to say, if we would have talked, Arne, earlier this year, maybe just 6 months ago, we would have been talking probably about your book. And the book has lots of provocative takes in it. Like it starts out from the very beginning that says, our education system runs on lies, which I would have loved to have talked to you about, but the whole world changed in April. And in April, 1.5 billion young people were kept out of school globally due to school closures, and countries took very different tactics in how to handle the coronavirus, and many of them have flattened the curve. We are definitely now a global leader in the wrong metric. We are now, the United States, a global leader in the number of cases, and the way that we have handled it, and I shouldn't say the way we have handled it, at the federal government level, the leadership has been lacking, and you have called that out. I wonder what you think now we do as districts are putting together patchworks of plans to try and make the best that they can do locally as local leaders. But I'm worried about invisible kids. I'm worried about kids that fall behind. I'm worried about kids in foster care, kids that are homeless, kids that are marginalized in general. And I'm fearing a catastrophe. What's your take right now on what we do to keep equity front and center for those kids?
Well, first, let me just say, we just shouldn't even be here. And I just can't tell you how furious, how disheartening, how heartbreaking it is that you and I even have to have this conversation now. As you said, other countries have figured this out. Other countries have flattened the curve because President Trump just sort of wished this thing would go away, hoped it away, wave a magic wand, have it go away. We've had tens of thousands of additional deaths, so many people sick, and whether or not we can go back to physical school is very, very much up in the air and looking every day less likely in most places. So what do we do now to fight for equity? We can't look to the federal government. Tragically, they're a huge part of the problem. They should be investing $150 to $200 billion in our schools now to make them safer for kids, more PPE, more masks, more cleaning supplies, more custodians, more plexiglass. I'd love to see a massive tutoring program that would help on the equity front. Unfortunately, right now, I don't see any of that coming. So as discouraging as that is, what gives me hope is what I'm seeing from local superintendents. And they are being as thoughtful, as compassionate, working consistently through an equity lens. And I think they're trying to do a couple different things. First and foremost, keep kids fed. And throughout this terrible pandemic, schools have been still distributing tens of millions of meals every single day. I do a food distribution call every week. That's been extraordinary to see. Working hard on kids' social and emotional health, telehealth has become very real. And as you know so well, we had lots of kids who were struggling before. Now lots of kids whose whole worlds have been turned upside down. We're living sort of in a relatively stable family, and then mom or dad loses their paycheck, and everything's everything's a question mark. And then trying to figure out the educational piece of this. One of the best things I think we can do is we're fighting for fairness and we're fighting for equity. Where schools can't physically open, think about schools serving those children that you talk about who are most marginalized, who are most disadvantaged, be they homeless, be they foster kids, be they kids just who can't stay at home because mom or dad is an essential worker, whatever it might be. Think about those kids, schools being open to start with only for those kids, and having them come in once a week, twice a week, 3 days a week to meet with their teacher, to meet with a social worker or counselor, to pick up food. And if we're going to start with anybody, that's exactly who we need to start with.
You just asked, or you just called for a massive investment from the federal level if they were going to do it, if they were going to exercise some leadership. How would you like to see that money used? Where would you put that to have the biggest impact?
Well, first, again, we just have to get our schools to the safest place possible. Yes, for children, but for their parents, for their grandparents, for teachers, for custodians, for bus drivers, staff, principals, everybody. And making sure those schools are clean, making sure that we are able to practice physical distancing, making sure we have enough PPE. Again, whether it's plexiglass or other things. Those are all the things that I'd like to see happen. But what I've been pushing for, what I wanted to actually, this is how naive I was in sort of, March and April and May, I was talking about bringing everyone back to school, or as many children as we could in July, now, after 4th of July holiday, because we know about the COVID slide, we know about the summer slide, we know about the kids that are most at risk coming back to school this fall, 6, 7, 8 months behind. I would love to have seen a massive tutoring program, voluntary, mandatory, whatever, starting this month. Because as a nation, we absolutely have failed. It's been just a horrific failure at dealing with this pandemic. That wasn't even, part of the conversation. It wasn't even possible. But as we go back this fall, I would again love to see a massive tutoring program, whether it's, retirees, whether it's young, recent college grads who are, it's a tough job market out there, 300, 400, 500,000, you pick a number, tutors who are working with kids either physically or virtually, those who are furthest behind, to help them catch up.
In the early days, and by early days, I mean like spring, in the early spring, educators and pediatricians were saying that being out of school was going to have a social emotional impact on kids, a mental health impact on kids, and that the longer it proceeded, that it was going to just get worse. Now we have educators and even pediatricians in some cases walking that back, because you get a mandate from the president and for the current Secretary of Education saying go back to school or else. Now educators are starting to say the opposite of like, no, you can't make us go back to school if it's going to be unsafe for kids. How do you split the difference on that? I mean, if the longer kids are out of school, it hurts them. What do we have to do to make sure that we're not hurting them?
Well, first, as you know so well, the president has no ability to mandate anything here. So it's, as usual, he's a bully who bluffs hard, and there's nothing there. You can't threaten people to go back to school. You can't bully them to go back to school. If he truly wanted kids in school, he'd be making the kinds of massive investments that I'm talking about. They've had no interest in doing that. They've talked about just the opposite, as you know so well. Talked about taking money away from schools. They don't have the ability to do that either. The president of the United States doesn't fund public education. Congress does. So let's just say what he says is irrelevant to reality. He can talk, he can bluff, he can bluster, but it's basically irrelevant. Having said that, everybody wants children to go back to school. When I ran the Chicago public schools for 7.5 years, we never missed a day of school. We never had a snow day, and I actually got lots of pushback on that sometimes from students. Never had a strike, never missed a day. But it wasn't obviously just because of the educational piece, although that was important. It was because school was often the safest place for children to be. There's a place where they got not just 2, but 3 meals a day, certain kids. And so, no one knows more than I how critically important it is for kids to be around other kids, to be around caring adults, to have that type of environment. Having said that, as important as all that is the first and foremost thing that we must think about is the health and safety of well-being of our children and the adults who are in charge of their care. And so the goal for me is not to reopen schools. The goal for me is to keep schools open. And if we open schools and have a disastrous spread of the virus of the pandemic, and then have to close schools again in 2 or 3 weeks, or whatever it might be, 4 weeks. All we do is further re-traumatize kids and endanger, teachers, adults, staff, parents, grandparents, guardians, caregivers. If you watch what happened in Israel, they opened up. They were down to almost no cases in that country. They opened up, had a massive spike in cases, about half of which they're attributing directly to the reopening of schools, and shut it all back down. So we all share the same goal, as a parent, as an educator, teachers. We all want our kids back in school, but we can only do that if it's safe. And then the final thing I'll say on that one is that schools aren't bubbles. They're not islands. If we truly, as adults, cared about kids going back to school, didn't just talk about it, we would be knocking down the rate of cases in our communities. You want to see declining rates of cases. You want to see positive tests at below 5%. And unfortunately, right now, as we speak today, I think about 40 states cases are actually increasing. So you have colleges that said they're going to open. They're starting to have to walk that back. Nobody wants kids staying home, but we can only open schools if it is safe and responsible to do so. And that's only possible if we're beating back this virus in our communities. And we have lacked the leadership, and we've lacked the discipline so far to do that. And that's absolutely heartbreaking to see.
Throughout the world, there are countries like the Netherlands and, other so-called first world nations that are actually going back to school, and they have staggered plans for making it happen. Either kids are going to be in small clusters that they stay in, they're going to seriously reduce class sizes. They're going to in some cases, they're not going to do anything super drastic except for making sure that kids stay in small clusters throughout their entire time at school. And they'll be able to know if there's any outbreaks, where things are happening. A lot of them are relying on the science that is telling us that kids are not really the big problem in terms of transmission. That might be turning around a little bit in terms of the science. But I would just have to ask you, after spending all those years under a president with a functional government, what goes through your mind when you see where we are as a country, when we're being ranked amongst like Mexico and Afghanistan in terms of our competitors for our plan and our planning for how we're responding?
Yeah, I don't even have any words. It's just devastating. And this, was maybe a natural disaster, pandemic, that morphed pretty quickly here in the United States to a man-made disaster. We have created this monster. We have fed this monster. And rather than dealing with it openly and honestly, rather than dealing with the science, President Trump just tried to wish it away. And you can fool a lot of people. He's a master illusionist, but you can't fool a pandemic. And we should not, like I said, we shouldn't even be having this conversation. And so just to see it's not just the absence of leadership, it's malevolent leadership. It's leadership that has led to countless deaths of children, of adults. And I've said very publicly, and I hate to say it, it hurts my heart to say it, but President Trump truly doesn't care whether kids or teachers or parents lives or die. He truly doesn't care.
How do you think the governors are doing? How would you rate the governors?
I think there's a real spread, and I have much more faith in local leadership. Some governors, not all. Obviously, what's happening in Florida and Georgia, some places is just disastrous. You see other places that are working really hard, but I rely on mayors. I rely on school superintendents. That's who I'm talking to. These are people who live in real communities, and they're working really, really hard. But you see people having real success. And you see other places really struggling. You see places as interesting like Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island, that's done an extraordinary job from day one, and is just they're winning there. They're winning there. You can say it's a smaller state, you can say all that, but she had a discipline and a relentlessness and a creativity that early on that many others lacked. And I guess what's so devastating here is it's like a tsunami. It's like a tidal wave that we saw it coming across to our country, and we just stood and sort of just watched it. We didn't react. We didn't move. We didn't do anything, to prepare ourselves. And now we're just in denial mode. And it's devastating. It's devastating.
You've said in several interviews that you have seen hopeful signs from superintendents and from things you've seen in local districts. Why? Like, what gives you hope there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so much. So you go back to when this started. No one, we all were in school, and then within a matter of whatever it was, a week, 10 days, nobody was in school. And to see people work so hard to deal with something that no one had ever really fully anticipated or expected was remarkable. We started those food distribution calls right then. And schools aren't just places of education, they're social safety nets. To see the amount of care and attention and follow through, feeding children, feeding their families, feeding the larger community, it was extraordinary. Huge stress, a million things coming at you, barely missed a beat there. And when school districts were struggling, nonprofits would jump up and raise their hands and step up and continue to feed. So that was amazing to see. We talked about sort of the telehealth very quickly. Teachers, counselors, social workers, on their phones, texting kids, FaceTiming them, trying to stay in close contact. None of this stuff is perfect, but doing it in a really thoughtful way. So looking at the distribution of technology, iPads, other things, access to the internet. As you know so well, what this pandemic has done is it slapped us in the face of the massive inequities that have existed forever in education. Mm-hmm. And at the top of that list is access to technology. And it's still not perfect, but here in Chicago, they gave out 100,000 devices. Boston, they gave out 30,000 devices. A good friend who works with me here in Chicago is a superintendent in San Antonio, a very, very poor district. He has 49,000 students. They give out 47,000 devices. Mm-hmm. And then thinking not just about devices, but about Wi-Fi and internet, and places like South Bend, Indiana, parking Wi-Fi enabled school buses in communities that don't have access and creating those hot spots. So that's the kind of creativity that you've seen. Example after example, Broward County, Florida. Bob Runcie's doing a fantastic job there. Very early on, moving almost to a college model where, let's say, a teacher normally teaches 5 classes of algebra every single day. What they did very quickly is those teachers would teach via Zoom 1 class of algebra to all the students in the morning, and then the rest of the day would be basically office hours where they could, where the teachers could help students, individually in small groups. So that's the kind of, again, in terms of feeding kids, in terms of social emotional needs, in terms of access to technology, in terms of trying to keep learning going as best we can. None of it's perfect, none of it's easy, none of it's ideal, but people working extraordinarily thoughtfully, humbly, sharing successes, sharing failures, working through this stuff together. That's what gives me tremendous hope.
In previous times when you were doing all the work around building up and beefing up traditional public schools, and in your administration, you all did some things around choice and then also strengthening teaching and learning and standards and those things. But throughout all of that time, it feels like virtual learning and what we're calling distance learning now was kind of like the jobless cousin with bad credit in the reform world. and now suddenly distance learning, we're having to catch up. What do you think about the quality of what we're going to be able to do with distance learning for kids?
Yeah. Well, I think the quality is very, very uneven and spotty. And so when you think about professional development for teachers, this right now is the game. And really thinking through how teachers can be equipped to do this well and do this thoughtfully. And you have, again, teachers where this is just natural to them and they're doing an amazing job. I've seen this with my own kids, and you have other teachers who struggle with this. So that professional development piece of this has always been one that has probably punched under its weight in terms of investments, where we haven't seen enough return for those dollars. But now more than ever is the time. And I do think thinking about how we utilize teachers differently. Can we have an amazing algebra teacher teach not just 50 kids or 100 kids, but could they teach algebra to 500 kids or 1,000 kids or 10,000 kids in the morning? Can't do that with every class, but it enables us to sort of think very, very differently. And it's interesting, just again, as a parent with my own kids, the larger classes are okay with teachers, but the small breakout stuff on Zoom, the Zoom breakouts where you have 3, 4, 5 kids working together with a teacher, with a tutor, at least in our family, that's been a really positive experience. That's something our kids really like. And so not just PD for teachers to help them be effective here, but thinking about how we reach individual kids at the same time. And to your point, still, not every kid has a device. Not every kid is this easy or intuitive for. Or we know high school students, this is a lot better for them than it is for a pre-K or first or second grader. So as we think about returning to school this fall, I think you'll see districts where more high school students will be doing stuff virtually, distance learning, and bringing back some of those younger, smaller students, maybe using the high schools or soccer fields or football fields, really spreading out gyms to get them back into physical class, because they need that so much more than our older students do. And the final thing I say on the equity piece is that this is one where we just have to sort of think about every angle. It's three-dimensional chess. So it's not just at the district level, at the school level, at the grade level. Let me just give you a couple different scenarios that we're all trying to think through together. One is a teacher who may not be able to, may desperately want to come back and teach, physically in person, but just can't do it because of their underlying health conditions. And we're going to need to accommodate that teacher and allow them to teach virtually. You might have a child who they might be healthy, but their mom or dad or the grandma, the grandfather who's raising them may not be. So that child may not be able to come back to physical school because of what's going on in their home. And then you might have another child whose parent or both parents are essential workers, and they're going to have to be in school every single day. And so this is one where we're going to have to really think about fairness in what's right. I think crises like this always bring out both the best and the worst in us. I think we're seeing the worst at the federal level, but there's going to have to be some real sense of sacrifice here. And I'll just give an example where, my children have access to technology at home and a mom and dad who can help out a little bit. Maybe they're allowed to go back to school once a week or twice a week or for 2 mornings a week. And maybe another child that doesn't have all those privileges in same grade, same class, they might need to be in school 3 or 4 or 5 days a week. And we as parents, we as a community have to be willing to embrace that now more than ever. And I think the lessons that we teach our kids through this really difficult time, it's a horrible time. I so desperately wish we weren't here. We didn't need to be here. This was absolutely preventable. But at the same time, for our kids to see how we make these choices and how we think about our common humanity, my only hope is that for the rest of their lives, they'll learn some important lessons about how we take care of not just our own, but how we take care of our neighbors as well.
You said before that you think that this could be a good time to reimagine the way that we do a lot of things, like not just provide distance learning as an emergency stopgap, but actually to consider some of the deeper questions in education. Do you think that that's still going to happen? Like, is this going to be a time where we do reinvent things?
Well, I'd like to reimagine not just education, but the police, and we could talk about that as well if you want. Spend a lot of time on that these days. So let me just say a couple of things. Yeah, I've said repeatedly, for me, the goal is not to go back to quote unquote normal, because normal didn't serve, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of kids across this country well enough. So there's nothing romantic to me about going back to normal. There's so much that we can and should think about differently, and I'll just give you a couple things. One, just clearly the idea of a school calendar, starting in the fall and going through June and being off for the summer, that should be obsolete. Should have been obsolete a long time ago. As you know, that's based on the agrarian calendar, on kids working in the fields. Kids aren't working in the fields anymore, and there are so many students who need school not 9 months a year, but 10, 11, 12 months a year, who need school not 6 or 7 hours a day, but 11, 12 hours a day, with a whole host of enrichment programming, extracurriculars in those non-school hours. So thinking very, very differently about the calendar, thinking about competency versus seat time. And what do I mean by that? For me, the goal is not to pass algebra by sitting in algebra for 4 or 5 days a week for 9 months. The goal is to pass algebra when you actually know algebra. And for certain students, that might be 3 months. For other students, that might be 9 months. For other students, that might be 12 months or 15 months. And there's no right or wrong answer there, but you should be able to move when you're ready. Again, closing the digital divide, really thinking about equity. There's so many places where if we had courage now we could do what we should have been doing 5 or 10 or 25 years ago. And if we don't use this opportunity to reimagine education, shame on us. To answer your question directly, do we have the courage to do that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure we do. And the status quo is the status quo for a real reason, and you have to push very, very hard against that. But it would be, to me, just an absolute tragedy just to go back to what was there before, because what was there before was not close to being good enough for far too many children, whether it's children in inner cities, whether it's children in rural communities, whether it's children in Appalachia, whether it's children on Native American reservations. What we're doing wasn't close to being good enough. So I don't want to, this is a really, really, really tough time. It's a horrific time. It's a dark time. But I don't want to, overly romanticize what we had before. I do want to use this to leapfrog, to springboard, and do those things that we should have been doing a long time ago. And if we can do that, some good comes of that. And I try and be very, I think I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm also trying to be very realistic. There's nothing inevitable to me about progress. There's nothing about things as, the long arc of the universe bending towards, justice. That only bends with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And what we've seen is, so the past couple of years, we've seen things in this country bend precipitously away from justice, away from fairness, away from equity. And so we have to be willing to show some courage that we haven't had and do some things very differently if we're going to get to a better place for kids.
You have been working on an issue. You just mentioned justice, and I worry about all the things that can be aggravated by COVID school closings and kids being home and not having a safe place to put kids during the day. I also worry about things like there are rumors right now that there are going to be a wave of that unemployment's only going to get worse. There will be a wave of evictions in places where evictions are still possible, even bankruptcies and mortgage payments missed. And there's no real hope coming down the pipe that I can see. Maybe you see something different coming down the pipe to help families be economically secure enough to even have their kids learn, right? And I'm wondering if you think that there's anything, again, barring the federal government stepping in, that states can do just to make sure that families are economically secure enough to even keep their kids in some form of schooling.
Yeah, there are a couple levels to that question. So there are some things that cities and states can do, but this is a federal issue. And again, this is where the lack of leadership at the federal level is devastating. And you look at what they did, in the earlier stimulus package that passed, they did 12 or 13 billion dollars for public education out of a $2.2 trillion package. It was a tiny percent of money. We obviously didn't do everything, perfectly by any stretch, when we were there, but we passed our stimulus package in 2009. My numbers won't be exact. It was about $787 billion, and $100 billion of that went to education. We saved hundreds of thousands of teacher jobs, and was so proud of that. It wasn't enough. But we took very, very seriously our obligation and the opportunity to do whatever we could to protect public education. This administration, candidly, wants to starve public education and has no interest in supporting that. And so the economic impact that you're talking about, as tough as the previous school year has been, this year is going to be tougher. And why is that? Last year, districts weren't hit with a reduction in their funding. This year, as you know so well, most of K-12 education, 90% in most places, comes from local property taxes and sales taxes at the state and local level. Those things are taking anywhere between a 10 and a 25% cut. So in the midst of all these challenges around feeding kids and telehealth and the distance learning you talked about, there's going to be a real financial impact this school year that we didn't see last year. And cities and states do not have the ability to backfill that. That has to come at the federal level. So these cuts are going to happen to education absent the federal government stepping in. Unemployment is going to continue to rise. It's an indirect measure, but it's a pretty accurate one. We're just watching the demand for food every single week. and that demand for food is continuing to grow. We've seen the lines at food distribution centers at places around the country, people getting in line at 4 or 5 in the morning, which is just tells you everything you need to know, unfortunately. So, if and when kids can come back to a physical school safely, and that's totally up in the air, all of these other challenges remain, and candidly, they're going to get tougher. They're going to get worse. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I always have to just try and tell the truth, or give my sense of where things are going, and the economic hit that families and local communities and states are taking. That's just beginning, and the impact on public education is not going to be pretty.
Well, that gets you into some fairly dicey territory when we think about things like school choice. So at this time right now, you have more well-to-do families, or families with resources, that are starting to do things like micro schools and pod schools, and they're hiring their own teachers and having small collectives. There was a story I read recently. A mom put out a call saying she was going to do that. She wanted to get some friends together, and 200 people responded, and they're going to hire their own teachers. And that's not going to be something that's going to be available to people that don't have the kind of resources to do that sort of thing during this time. There are a lot of people in the school choice side of things who are saying, stop funding the schools right now, start funding families. So give the money directly to families so that they can actually purchase whatever educational opportunities that they want for their kids. What do you think about that? Especially, you served on the Democratic side of things, which hasn't always been a big fan of school choice to that level, to that extreme. What do you think about that now?
Yeah, so these are, you can call them complicated issues. For me, they truly aren't. I don't begrudge any family doing what they want to try and help their kids learn and be successful. I understand that. I do think it is the role of the government to fight for those kids whose families don't have the opportunities to do that. I had a wealthy friend reach out to me recently, and they're going to hire a teacher for their child, not a pod, not a whatever. That's what they're going to do. And that was an interesting call to have. I understand that. Very, 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 very few families in America can do that. And I think it is the role of public education, it is the role of government to fight for all kids and to make sure that all kids have a chance to get a great education. And we can't waver from that. We shouldn't waver from that. We should be doing that more than ever before. And so I don't personally see the conflict in that. There have always been massive inequities. Government's job is to try and fight those inequities. But let's be real about everything. We talk about what needs to change. On a system, the joy, the hope, the promise of public education is it's the great equalizer. That regardless of your zip code or your race or your socioeconomic status, if you work hard, you should be able to do well. But where you have a system, where, as we talked about earlier, where 90% of the funding comes from local and state taxes and local property taxes, you have a system where, by definition, the children of the wealthy throughout America, in most places, get more money spent on them every single year than the children of the poor. So baked into the system of public education in our country from the get-go has been a system that exacerbates inequality, that heightens disparities. And when I led the Chicago Public Schools, we sued the state on funding because we in Chicago received less than half the money of children who happen to be born 8 or 9 miles north of us along Lake Michigan in Wilmette and Winnetka. And you think about the compounding impact of that, 14 years pre-KK, first through 12, of less than half the money spent on children who are poor versus children who are born on third base. It's staggering. And so again, we talk about reimagining education and where we need to go. These inequities have always been in there. They are part and parcel of the system. Do we have the courage, parents who want to hire a tutor, or a dance teacher, or an art, whatever, let more power to them. Let them do that. I have no problem with that. What I do have a problem is when we don't take care of the kids collectively whose families don't have the ability to do that. That's our collective responsibility. That's our collective obligation. And we can't leave that talent. We can't leave that talent on the sidelines. We can't afford to do it.
Pushing a little harder on this point, though, would you support some of the per pupil money being given directly to the parents as an educational stipend for the kids, so that they can actually match what some of those parents in Marin and other places are doing in form of tutoring or buying. They're basically buying teachers is what they're doing.
Yeah, well, I guess I struggle with that because if we see funding for regular school districts, regular public schools going down now, do you further take from that pot to do that? And that at a time of declining, revenue, declining resources for public education, I struggle with that because at some point, we have to strengthen these systems. If there was some additional or supplemental resources, then I'd be open to that conversation. But what I'm not open is, cutting the pie even smaller now. And what I would love to see is a massive investment, in education. I talked about, 150 to 200 billion. I talked about a massive tutoring program. Now, whether you give that money to districts or to parents, I'm more than open on that. But I want to make sure that kids who are behind have a chance to catch up. And so we could talk about the fine points of that. Honestly, that's an academic conversation now because this administration has shown zero interest, none, in putting the kind of resources behind public education that we need.
So when you think about all of this disruption that's taking place right now, all the things that are being upset, where are we going to go with some of the mainstays of reform? Things like teacher preparation, evaluation, accountability specifically. I'm really worried about a data vacation. I'm really worried that states are going to take a data vacation.
Yeah.
And 2 years from now, we're going to have kids that fell further behind because we don't have the data to show where they were.
Well, that would be devastating and unacceptable. So what I would do if I was a superintendent, the first thing I would do this fall, whether it's, again, physically in person or virtually, is you need to assess every single child and see where they're at. And this has been an unprecedented time, and to have no clue where students are, it makes no sense whatsoever. There'll be a small percent of kids who have flourished during this time, who learn better, virtually, who, it meets their learning style in a way that physical school doesn't. And those kids, may actually have been accelerated. Mm-hmm. But I think most kids will struggle. And just to go back to where you and I started the conversation, those students that are already the most marginalized almost inevitably are the ones that have fallen the furthest behind. And you can't try and, improve a situation. You can't try and help kids catch up if you don't have a clue where they are. Mm-hmm. And so, when you just said that, I never heard of a data vacation. That scares the heck out of me. Mm-hmm. And we cannot afford to do that. We're dealing with so many things that are sort of unknown. We got to try and know as much as we can. These are going to be some hard truths. They're going to be some brutal truths, but we need to know in August and September, where students are. And again, I wish we'd done this in July. That's what I wanted to do, is assess then and go find those kids that were the furthest behind and get rolling with them. That didn't happen, but we're going to need to know where every kid is going, this fall. The only way to do that is through assessment. And then we need to look at the end of the school year and see who we've caught up and who we haven't caught up and what's going on there. But absent data, you make a already extraordinarily difficult situation impossible. That would be a travesty for children. If we, again, I've never heard that term before. I hope I don't hear it again.
It's my term because it's my fear. I keep saying, man.
I got nothing to worry about. You're giving me a nightmare now, boy.
This is where it comes from. It comes from states saying things like, there's too much going on in the lives of kids for us to maintain a testing system now.
No. Again, let's be clear. This is people confuse stuff intentionally. For me, this is not high stakes. This is not any. I wouldn't even call it a test. It's just an assessment. It's just where are students? What a benchmark? Where are they now? And again, if we don't know that, if we don't know where we're starting, we don't know where we need to take them. And we're going to see some very different things happen. We're going to see some places that do an amazing job of accelerating kids and helping them catch up. We're going to see some places that don't do a good job there. And this is not we're all learning together. We're all in this together. So we have to do this work with tremendous humility. We have to be absolutely transparent. We have to share successes. We have to share where we're struggling. But the only way to do that is if we know the facts. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a child's learning or a car or a company or a sports team, I don't know how you improve anything if you don't know where you are, if you don't know the baseline. It's just not possible. So this does not, anyway, I'm going on too long here, but
No, I mean, I think it's
the
important.
last thing anyone needs is a vacation from reality. President Trump has given us way too long of it, tried to give us a vacation from reality. It did not work for COVID, and it doesn't work for education.
Yeah, we have stories bubbling up of districts that are not going to give any failing marks on any assignment, even ones that warrant it. The thing that chills me when we started with talking about your book was that phrase that education is run on lies. Lies, lies, lies. There was one article about your book that said if you did a word cloud from your book, the word lies would be one of the biggest words that would pop up. And I think oftentimes we're lying to our kids about their high school diploma, like how much it says about whether or not they're prepared for college, prepared for the world. I think we're going to start baking some things in now with even the assignments that we give them not being graded properly.
Yeah. So it's just so interesting. And this is where there's a paternalism or something that is just so deeply disturbing. And to pass kids along and say they're doing okay when they're not, to give them a high school diploma and then have them unable to take college level class in college, have to take all remedial classes and burn through Pell Grants and loans. It's interesting. My friend, the former mayor of Minneapolis, Betsy Hodges, wrote a really deep article about what white liberals have done to hurt people and to hurt communities. And I just put this exactly, right in that category. And so we have to know the truth. We have to tell kids the truth. For me, it's always about not just passing kids through, which is all it does is set them up for failure, as you know better than anybody. It's always about high expectations, but now more than ever before, high supports with that. And again, not just academic supports, food supports, social emotional supports in terms of time, supports in terms of technology. But for me, that's the winning formula. It's the highest expectations and the highest of supports and removing every barrier, every impediment to student success. But once you just start, pitying kids or feeling sorry for them or feeling that, poor kids can't learn or kids that are struggling can't learn or Black and brown kids can't learn and need a lower bar somehow, boy, that's about as insidious as it gets.
Do you think that things like issues like teacher prep and evaluation and state standards are off the table now?
Why should anything be off the table? And again, are we going to throw away things that are important? So, teacher prep is I think been an area of huge challenge for a long time. I've been very public. While there are some good schools of education, many are just cash cows and passing students through who aren't ready. And that's not my opinion. You survey young teachers around the country, and very consistently, 2/3 to 3/4 of passionate, committed young teachers said they're not ready to teach. And I've said if that was true in the medical profession, if doctors said they weren't ready to practice medicine, we'd have a revolution in this country. But somehow we just don't value education. We don't value teachers. We think that's okay. So how we train teachers in this virtual world, this has got to be part of teacher prep. And this young generation of teachers, some might be just amazing at this, but this is going to be part of every teacher's reality and should going forward. When and if we get past this, pandemic, it should be part of what we teach. Having high standards now more than ever. What do we do? Reduce standards now? Doesn't make any sense. So, we got to be able to walk and chew gum. We got to be able to do multiple things at the same time. And to say that things that are important are off the table, I just don't. That's not my mentality.
So we keep pushing for it in your mind. For those things,
there's no choice. Again, if at the end of the day, if we believe that adults matter in kids' lives tremendously, that great teachers have a disproportionate impact on student learning for better or for worse, if we believe that great principals are, just invaluable to having a great school, that it's impossible to have a great school without a great principal, if we truly believe that human talent, not just the academic talent, but the relationships in the heart, if we truly believe that matters, then we have to know that children need that now more than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
So to somehow walk away from that, like I said, that's mind-boggling to me. That's so counterintuitive. More than ever before, students need amazing, competent, compassionate, well-qualified teachers.
Mm-hmm.
More than ever before, our children need principals who are unbelievable CEOs and are solving problems that were inconceivable 4 months or 6 months or a year ago. So we need to I'm tired of the term double down, but redouble our efforts to produce and support and find and highlight and reward and compensate and train great teachers. And we need to, more than ever before, not tolerate those situations where teachers aren't doing a good job for children and where they're not improving. And we need to be trying to find and train and highlight amazing principals who are doing phenomenal work every single day. And absent that, again, I'm all the technology. I'm all in on that. We talked about that a bunch. But technology is never going to be a replacement for great teachers. Technology is never going to be a replacement for great principals and great schools. It's always a combination, the blended learning. Way before the pandemic, we all know that's great teachers coupled with great technology. Having kids find their passions. That's the holy grail. That's what we're looking for. That search, that goal, that destination, that journey. The need for that has never been clearer. Never been clearer.
I like that, to say that, technology is never going to be a good replacement for great teachers. But at the same time, I think the bigger problem we've been facing is that mediocre teachers will never be a great replacement for great teachers. And I think that's the bigger problem. And during this time, it feels like states will have to pump the brakes on many of the things that they considered important before because they're in emergency mode.
Yeah. So, you may be practically right, but I just want to continue to push and caution that this is not a time to pump the brakes on any of this. We talked about earlier, reimagining schools, reimagine what this looks like. The thing that I did, there's the mantra of local control that I understand, and I get the history, and I, understand some of the pushback I got when I was at the federal level. Because I traveled the country, 15,000 school districts. Everywhere I went, I asked one question. I asked, show me what district in the United States of America systematically identifies their hardest working, their most successful teachers and principals, and then matches them with the kids in the communities who need the most help. And for all the local control, for all the talk about how important that is, there's not a single district, there's not one district in America out of 15,000 that systemically identifies their best talent and puts it with the kids who need the most help. And if we're going to reimagine anything, why don't we reimagine that? Why don't we get kids the help that they need most? It's not a perfect analogy, but when President Obama went after Osama bin Laden, who did he send to go do that hard work? He didn't send a bunch of rookies. He didn't send a bunch of just folks he didn't know. Who did they send? They sent the Navy SEALs. They sent the best of the best to do the hardest work. We should be sending the best of our adults to do the hardest work. Again, inner city, rural, remote, Native American reservations. Go back to my book, talk about lies. We all say great teachers matter. We all say we care about teachers. We all say they make a difference in kids' lives, but we lack the courage. To get the children the best of the best when that's when they need the most. And then when we fail to do that, again, the system itself exacerbates the inequities, exacerbates the unfairness. At the top of the list of how we need to reimagine things, I'd put that right at the very top of the list.
So you have a sign behind you that says "Ready for Joe." I am going to go out on a limb and say that relates to Joe Biden, candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden, running for president. For those people that are big fans of the Obama era education agenda, who might be looking and seeing that we're in a different time now, that the agenda that we all appreciated through the Obama years is not as easily sellable today. What are you expecting to see in the next administration? There's a good chance that we'll have a change in administration. We'll have a new Secretary of Education. What's going through your mind about what you want to see happen immediately with the new administration, if there is one?
Yeah, and to be real honest, like I hate to, I'm not even thinking about that. Like for me, this is so much bigger than any nuanced education policy. I wish we had the luxury of debating that. And I don't say this lightly. We are fighting for our democracy. We're fighting for our nation. And what's at stake here is just extraordinarily important. And I hope, my daughter can vote in this election. I hope this is the most important election of her entire life. I hope there's not another election this important. So everything is at stake. And where you have a con man who is the head of the United States, where you have a con man who is a Russian agent, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. When you have someone who is fanning the flames of racism and hatred, every single day, overtly, intentionally. And I don't take anything for granted that we'll have a new president. And yes, I desperately hope it'll be President Biden. But people have to vote. We have to vote in overwhelming numbers. We have to vote knowing that Russia will interfere and cheat. We have to know that, and again, I don't say this lightly, that there may not be a peaceful transfer of power. These are unprecedented and scary times. And so I hope to get to the point when we can talk about the nuances of education policy and what President Biden will do. But for the next 100 plus days, I'm truthfully not thinking about that. I'm just thinking about how we try and save our country, how we try and save our nation. And there's nothing foregone that, in my mind that's going to happen. Polls don't vote, people do. And if people don't turn out and vote, like, last election, people just sort of assumed, someone will win. And it's those consequences have been devastating. And it's not just at the presidential level. It's, we all knew what a bad person, Trump was. We knew the soullessness. We knew the lack of empathy. We knew he was a total con. I'll speak for myself. What I didn't anticipate what was the senators, Republican senators and Republicans in Congress just laying down for him. We thought there'd be some guardrails, and what we're seeing is just a horrific, abdication of responsibility. It's been power over country. It's not party. It's not country over party. It's been power over country, and so that's my focus. And I said I hope to get into a detailed and nuanced conversation about education policy. I will say I visited lots of schools with Vice President Biden, lots of colleges, lots of community colleges. He has a huge heart for this. I know how much this matters to him. As you know, his wife, Dr. Biden's been a lifelong educator who has chosen to work, in community colleges, has chosen to work often with the immigrant community, and so I know where their heart is. But this is, I don't think any of us should have the time or energy to debate those fine points now. We have to fight for our country. We have to fight for our democracy. And I truly don't know if I say this so seriously, I truly don't know if our democracy can survive another 4 years of where we're going. And so everything is at stake here, everything.
So the larger issues, the democracy issues, the issues that you're basically saying that the bigger issues overshadow kind of like the concern really that we have about schools and how schools are going to run.
It's not even close. And we should, again, I want to have those conversations. I want to have that debate, but that's a luxury. Like, we're fighting for our life now. We are fighting for our life as a country. And so let's get to the point where we can have those very serious and vigorous conversations or debates or whatever. But we're not even close to that. And when you look at voter suppression, when you look at gubernatorial elections that were, stolen and messed with in Georgia and Florida, when you just see what's going on, if we win by 2%, I don't think he contests, he doesn't leave, it goes to the Supreme Court. And it's chaos. These are unprecedented times. A peaceful transfer of power, I don't see that right now. I don't. Really? Do you see him shaking hands and welcoming the next person to the White House? Not going to happen. People don't understand how serious this is. And so for me, we have to win by overwhelming numbers. I'm used to, playing basketball where if you're somewhere on the road, You know the refs are going to cheat you, and you can't complain, and you got to win by 20, so you actually win by 8. And we got to win by such overwhelming margins that he can't contest it, that he can't try and do whatever, and that Russian interference, which we know is coming, it is inevitable, it is going to happen, and they are very, very good at what they do. You have to account for all that. So folks have to register. They have to vote. They have to turn out. They can't assume anything happens. And then if that happens, then yes, let's talk about all the detailed nuances of education policy, early childhood, K to 12, higher ed. But it is so premature and I don't know what the word is, presumptuous right now to think that we can have those conversations, because we if we don't do the work over these next 100+ days, we won't have that luxury. We won't have that opportunity.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap. I mean, the importance of our democracy being at stake, I think, is something for the next, like you're saying, the next 100 days or so is going to be front of mind for most people. I think with all the uncertainty that parents have, though, definitely marginalized parents, about their economic security, their economic state of things, what they're going to do with their kids, whether or not their kids are going to fall behind, is also going to remain kind of like the daily issue, the bread and butter issue for real families every day. And hopefully there is help coming in some form. In any, I agree with you that we can't do 4 years of this type of just complete breakdown and deterioration of all of our institutions, all of our decorum, all of our norms, all of the things that we hold true about the country. Just can't have another 4 years of decay. So I appreciate you coming on today. Really appreciate everything that you have to say. You give us lots to chew on. I do want to say, we've got just a couple minutes. Chicago Cred, you have been working on for the last few years. You've made a shift. It's not really a shift because education is always important to you. And right now you're thinking that gun violence is a place where you can put your effort to have a big, audacious goal. You guys are looking at reducing gun violence by 80%, like 20% a year, which to me sounds like a big and audacious goal. As you see like fires being stoked in cities, Chicago getting beat up on, even at the presidential level, and becoming the whipping boy of the right wing. How do you think those efforts, that's going to affect your new work and the efforts that you have with reducing gun violence, making sure that people who are most victimized by gun violence have opportunities in life, workforce opportunities, and so on?
I often say that we're, maybe motivated by our successes, but we're also haunted by our failures. And on my watch, leaving Chicago Public Schools in my 7.5 years, we had a child killed on average every 2 weeks due to gun violence. It was a devastating loss of life. And when our family moved to DC, as bad as things were, things got a lot worse. And so I'm always going to preach deferred gratification, think about college and build for the long haul. But our kids on the South and West sides are living with a level of fear and trauma that is indescribable, where they literally, particularly our young Black men, don't know if they're going to live or die. And so all the stuff we preach long-term, it's speaking a foreign language if you're just trying to survive. And so all I'm trying to do is give kids their childhoods back. I'm trying to give them a chance to live free of fear and trauma, and then be able to concentrate on algebra trig and biology and physics and calculus and whatever it may be. We've had 3 consecutive years of double-digit reductions in violence here, which has been fantastic. This year has been very, very tough. We are going the wrong direction as a city. The neighborhoods where we're working the hardest, we've been working the longest since we started, while the city is up about 38% through the end of June in violence, which is terrible, those communities are down 38%. And so we know what works in a combination of street outreach. We have a big education piece, so we have young people getting high school diplomas and actually starting college this fall, life coaches, clinical services. But we have a lot of men who have grown up with trauma from the day they were born. And we have to help men heal. We have to help empower them to lead our city to a safer place and see the transformation that our men, many of whom who have been shot, many of whom unfortunately have also done their fair share of shooting, more than their fair share, to see them now being the positive leaders in the communities. This is the hardest work I've ever done. Some days it's the most heartbreaking, but it's by far the most inspiring.
Well, I appreciate that you're doing the work. Appreciate you coming on today and being with us, Arne. Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your moral leadership. Thanks for your clarity, and thanks for continuing to challenge the status quo. We need your leadership. Back at
I
you.
appreciate it. For all the people watching, you can find Arne Duncan on Twitter at Arne Duncan. He's one of the rare people that was able to get his exact name as a Twitter handle. So good for him. Follow him on Twitter. If you have any questions or want to follow up on anything we talked about today, you can always send me an email at christopher@activist.com and I will pass it along. Thank you all